Welcome to the Khushwant Singh LitFest 2022, beamed to you from London. My name is Efis Ijazuddin, and I'm based in Lahore in Pakistan. But my association with Khushwant Singh ji and his family, Rahul Singh, Mala, and also with Nilofer Bilamoria goes back over a number of years. In fact, my first contact with Khushwant Singh ji was in 1978 when I visited him in his flat in Sutan Singh Park. After that, every time I went to India, and particularly to New Delhi, it was to offer darshan to him and benefit from his advice and his benediction. This relationship remained until his death, and I was honored that I was asked by him and then later by his family to bring part of his ashes to his birthplace, Hadali, which is now in Pakistan, where we were able to immerse them both in the River Jhelum, as well as to install them in a plaque at the school that he attended as a young boy in the 1920s. My association with the Khushwant Singh Literary Festival, though, has been both at Kasoli and now, since COVID, via Zoom. And I'm delighted that we have this opportunity of presenting for you in the next 2 days the most remarkable array of talent and intellect that could be mustered on varied topics, and in which there'll be discussion on India's history in objects, on the Light of Asia, the translation by Sir Edwin Arnold, and then one on the Ukrainian Night. This will be on the first day, and it'll be followed, as I'll explain to you later, with sessions on Sunday. The Khushwant Singh Literary Festival has taken Khushwant Singh and his books from Kasoli in the Indian Himalayas to the Docklands of London in the United Kingdom. The KSLF has proven that art and common heritage and our thoughts can travel in time across continents and, in fact, beyond centuries. It has also proved that there is a better world, a virtual world without borders, where crossing boundaries does not entail either passports or restricted visas. Rahul and Nilofer had asked me to recite a poem which I'd composed some years ago, and I'm going to take the liberty of recalling it now. There was a time when time evoked tomorrows. Today, it speaks only of yesterdays. Where has the promise gone of fraternité sans frontières? Where are the tears we shed, the blood to irrigate our earth, once yours, now mine, once mine, now yours? Why must my only view of you be through the barrel of a gun? Why must I search for you in the debris of a divided sun? How long will this daily suicide last? While we have separate heavens there, will we have separate heavens there, or find ourselves sharing yet another common hell? The session, which will follow this, will be handled by Rachel Dwyer, and so, with your permission, I'll hand over to her. Rachel, it's yours.
Hello and welcome to the Khushwant Singh Literary Festival in London. I'm sorry again this year we're not meeting in person, but it's wonderful to be online, and perhaps it makes it even more accessible to those of you who can't come to London to join us today. But this festival once again celebrates the legacy of Khushwant Singh, author, scholar, journalist and iconoclast, discussing the values he stood for and addressing his concerns. It's in London because London is where he worked and studied, and it helped to shape many of his passions and concerns. These include closer ties between India and Pakistan, and London is one of the places where this happens, equal opportunities for women worldwide, and disseminating values of tolerance, democracy and compassion in a world today where we seem to need these more than ever. And one of the main themes underlying the festival is that of ecology, a constant love of his and about which he wrote several books. So today, this festival, linked very closely to the subcontinent, is entirely organised by volunteers, and everybody comes together to do this as a labour of love. I think I'd just like to say a little bit more about the idea of ecology underlying the festival, and how much Khushwant talked about these in his writings, whether his literary writings, such as The Train to Pakistan, with its famously evocative passages about the monsoon, a book that many people, of course, will know him for as something of a classic, as well as being made into a film. But he also wrote books about trees, including one called Trees of Delhi. So in honour of him, every year, for every speaker, trees are planted at Kasauli, for him. At Kasauli, where he lived, trees have been planted for him. But this year, from the festival, they're called Trees for Tigers because they're being planted in the Sundarban National Park in West Bengal. So I think this theme of ecology underlies much of the way that people look at India and South Asia, often without always realizing that that's what they're doing. And, this morning I looked and saw the temperatures in parts of Western India in the high 40s. I think that's a reminder to us that we ought to be thinking about this more than ever. Well, today I'm delighted to introduce two very old and very special friends of mine, who are going to be talking about a wonderful new book about India. I'll start off by introducing the discussant, who is Dr. Zaria Masani. Zareer is a well-known figure. He often takes a stand against popular views of India today, always defending his corner with great humour and vigour and perhaps courage, one might say, too. A student, he took his doctorate at Oxford, and since then has written many books, including about figures such as Macaulay. He's currently working on another book on Warren Hastings, the first Governor General of India, and he's also written a biography of Indira Gandhi. He's written Indian Tales of the Raj and India from Raj to Rajiv with Mark Tully. I also feel I know a great deal more about Zareer than just from meeting him, because I've read his memoir, All Is Said, about his relations with his fabulous parents, great characters, and of course his father, Minu Masani, now seen as a very important figure in the history of Indian politics. And he's talking to Richard Blurton. Richard worked for many years at the British Museum. He joined in 1986 and he retired 4 years ago as the head of the South and Southeast Asia section. Richard, I'm very grateful to you for years of taking my first year undergraduate students around the museum. And, many of them said they'd never been to a museum before, but having been, they now felt it was a space they could return to and feel at home in. So that was really a great achievement. Richard has worked on many areas as an archaeologist as well, from North Africa to Afghanistan, and in southern India worked with Dr. George Michel, another SOAS alumnus. And he's arranged many exhibitions at the British Museum over the years, as well as in India itself. I think really Richard's book collection is well known. His books on Assam, Bengal, Burma, and Hindu art are still very much used and read today. While at the museum, really dealing not just with the existing collections and bringing them up to date, but acquiring new works, paintings by Rabindranath Tagore, prints by Krishna Reddy, modern textiles, photographs, and large-scale sculpture by Mrinalini Mukherjee, or Dilu, as we know her better. And in retirement, he seems to be, like Zareer, keeping us all ashamed of our own lack of productivity. I now have a new book, a wonderful book, which I was lucky to see some previews of, India, A History Through Objects, which is appearing next month, I believe. It's about the works of the British Museum, which he knows so well. And to have them brought to life in this book by somebody who knows these objects almost as everyday life, I think really gives it some warmth. So let me hand over to Zareer to introduce the talk and Richard's new book. Thank you.
Richard, very nice to be speaking to you about this wonderful book, which is extremely ambitious because you really start 1,000,000 years BC and bring it up to the present. And you not only focus on the wonderful collections of the British Museum, but you have a lot of live art from India, from sites that you have visited and others. Could I ask you to kick off whether you were inspired in any way by Neil MacGregor's History of the World in 500 Objects?
Well, you are right to invoke Neil's work at the museum. His famous title, A History of the World in 100 Objects, was a project during the time I was in harness at the museum, and of course it was enormously influential. And in a sense, it has definitely spawned a whole load of further or it spawned an idea that this is how you can look at history, not just in terms of texts and memory, but also you can write history through objects. This is a highly revealing way of considering the writing of history. Many insights can be gained from the physical remains of the past, both remotely. You mentioned 1,000,000 years ago. In fact, my book begins actually with 1.5 million years ago, a single stone axe from southern India, and indeed comes right up to the present day.
May I interrupt you there to suggest?
Please.
Can you show us this wonderful axe?
Yes. It's the,
Oh,
here is the axe. It's from a site called, it's either from Atirampakam or from Pallavaram, which are two sites just outside Chennai. They were investigated in the 1850s by the great British geologist Bruce Foote, who had been who'd become aware of the work that was being done in France on early Stone Age accomplishments in the remote past, and he was able to recognize that this was indeed a man-made tool, work that's since been done there by the Sharma Heritage Center. Further excavations there have shown through the use of paleomagnetic dating methods that these axes are of extreme antiquity, and they're the oldest thing from the subcontinent in the British Museum collection. There's a much greater collection of them, I should add, in the museum in Chennai, and it will be a wonderful opportunity for one of my colleagues in the future to continue working on the links between these different parts of the collection.
Now, moving on, possibly almost 500,000 years or more, to the rather controversial Indus Valley civilization, which India and Pakistan fight for ownership of, but which certainly has no direct connection with anything that came later. What do your objects tell us about the Indus Valley civilization? Now, this particular necklace is a Roman one made out of imports from Indus Valley.
No, sorry. This necklace is, I put it in especially because it's from the royal tombs at Ur. So it's from southern Iraq, found in southern Iraq, and it's fascinating for the light it throws on the Indus settlements because of the materials it uses. These tubular carnelian beads, these long thin carnelian beads, are a product, or were a product of Indus craftsmen, and the blue beads, of course, are lapis lazuli, and lapis only comes from northeastern Afghanistan. So
Yes.
the appearance of these in an early 3rd millennium BC royal tomb in southern Iraq tells us something about the trading links, the contacts, the crossing borders, if you like, of these early inhabitants of the Indus Valley. As you quite rightly mentioned, the Indus Valley citizens had no concerns with boundaries of the sort that we struggle with today, and their sites are found throughout the Indus Valley, but also into northwestern India, in the modern states of Gujarat and Haryana and Punjab. So it's a very, very wide range. Involved in trade.
Could we see some of the seals, which I know you have, which are illustrated in your book?
Yeah, these are.
And what I would like you to address is this rather controversial question of who the Indus Valley belongs to, because it doesn't seem to have had any direct connection with later Aryan settlements. So have you been able to find any connections?
Well, archaeologically, there is continuity between the great settlements, large settlements like Kalibangan and Harappa and Mohenjo-daro and Lothal also. There is some connection, but it's not in terms of grandeur or of great urban civilization. It appears, none of this can be absolute yet, but it appears that the end of the Indus civilization was not cataclysmic, was not due to some intense, sudden invasion. There is no evidence of that. There is evidence of slow, gradual decline. And it seems clear that the Chalcolithic, the Copper Age settlements that we find in Western India in the succeeding periods do actually continue the legacy of the Indus civilization, but without its huge sophistication. So there is no continuity of the use of these stamp seals, for instance. And there is no continuity in terms of huge brick buildings. So it's a mixed picture, and like so many of these controversial subjects, it is neither one thing nor the other. Could I just point out, while we've got these seals up on the screen, I chose this one especially because, as you can see, it depicts a rhinoceros. Now, there haven't been rhinoceroses in the Indus Valley for a very, very long time, millennia. Other seals show elephants, and similarly, they haven't been seen in northwestern subcontinent for a very long time. And it seems clear, bearing in mind especially what Rachel was saying earlier, that there has been climate change in this zone. Some people have suggested that the huge number of brick buildings that were made in the Indus cities, to fire bricks, you have to have a large amount of wood, you have to cut down a lot of forests. If that is the case, you may well get climate change. And if you look at these depictions of animal life at that time, you can only come to that conclusion. So
now, I'm going to fast forward us a bit to a few 100,000 years, because I'm very conscious of the enormous ground we need to cover.
Yeah.
Fascinating though each aspect is.
Just before
So
we go on that image, can I just point out that long dice? That it's for gaming.
noted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, the playing and throwing of dice has a long tradition in India, with many depictions and many descriptions in the epics. Anyway, onwards.
What I'd like to ask you is another controversial question, which is the Aryan or Aryan, if we use the Indian pronunciation, settlements in India, which are present Hindutva brigade question, because everything is indigenous. Have you found evidence archaeologically? I know there's plenty of genetic evidence that there were major invasions from the Indo-Aryan, Indo-European areas, moving across North India southwards.
Well, this is, of course, as you rightly say, a controversial subject, but looking solely at the physical evidence, the things that you can hold in your hand, the things that you can look at, there is no absolute connection between objects and any early Indo-Aryan communities. We can't make that connection. Obviously, we have the texts, the Vedas, and especially the earliest of those, the Rig Veda, which describe the early presence of those people in what's probably the Western Punjab, and then the later Vedas describe probably what's the Eastern Punjab. But there are no objects that one can categorically say this ceramic, this item of metal or whatever was made by or used by speakers of a certain language. This is an area of huge pitfalls, and it's very important to remember that unless you have an inscription, there is no way of making a connection between what people speak and what they made.
Understood. Now, moving on a bit to the what many people regard as the acme of Indian, certainly ancient Indian civilization, was the Mauryan period, very much marked by these sculptures you're going to show us from Amravati, these which are wonderfully housed in the British Museum, thanks to a British civil servant, Elliot, who excavated them, discovered them, brought them to Madras, where many of them still are. So these so-called Elliot marbles or Amravati marbles, which really occupy a wonderful room in the British Museum. Can you tell us what they actually illustrate in terms of the wonderful Mauryan period?
Yes. These sculptures on the screen at present, there's an early one probably from about 100 BC. These sculptures all come from the Buddhist stupa, the domed structure, typical Buddhist structure at Amravati on the southeastern coast, on the Andhra coast of India. The earliest sculptures there date probably to about 200 BC, so we're in the zone of the very earliest surviving sculptures in stone found anywhere in India, and the latest ones are probably 8th or 9th century AD, so you have a hugely long period of Buddhist activity at this site in southern India. You mentioned quite correctly Elliot, who was there stationed in Guntur district in Andhra, southern Andhra, in the 1850s, but he also had a famous and particularly Scottish predecessor who was Major General Colin Mckenzie. Now, Mackenzie was the first Surveyor General of India, and he was the first person to visit Amravati and to draw anything of the ancient stupa. He visited it briefly in 1797, when he found that a local zamindar was raiding the stupa, using it as a quarry for his new palace, and many of the blocks were actually, I mean, it's fine limestone, were being burnt to produce mortar. So you know, the early history of the discovery and understanding of the great stupa at Amaravati is troubled, frankly. Later, Mckenzie came back and spent a long time recording what he saw there, but by that time a tank had been built in the top of the dome of the stupa, and so you know, our knowledge today of the upper part of the stupa is very limited. What we do have, though, is information about the lower part of the dome, and then the walkway all the way around it, the Pradakshinapatta, the zone where pilgrims and monks would circumambulate the stupa, honoring the relic that was held within it. And all of these elements were magnificently carved. And early on, there are stories from the life of the Buddha, stories from the Jatakas, but with no depiction of the Buddha image himself, because in early
could we see any other images?
Let's see whether, what's the next one? Here we are. Yes, well done. This one on the left side, divided into 4 different scenes, actually shows the birth of the Buddha. In the top right-hand corner, we see a female figure, that's Queen Maya, dreaming. And she dreamt, of course, that a white elephant would enter her side, and she would bear a male child, a prince. The panel to the left shows the interpretation of the dream. The one at bottom right, Queen Maya hanging onto the tree in the Lumbini Park. This is the birth of the Buddha. And the one on the bottom left is the presentation of the child Buddha to the family deity. Now, I don't know that we can see clearly at this point, but actually the birth of the Buddha, bottom right, and the presentation, bottom left, both have figures carrying cloth. On that cloth are footprints which mark the presence of the Buddha child. The Buddha is not depicted corporeally. Later, of course, he is, and this injunction on showing the actual body disappears. The other image on this screen shows an early depiction of the stupa. So it's domed, and it has a gallery all the way around the base for the Pradakshinapatta, and it's guarded by a magnificent multi-headed Naga king, and the top of the dome is an explosion of protective umbrellas.
Richard, what the Elliot Marbles very much demonstrated to me when I first visited the British Museum way back in the 1960s was the extent to which India's classical heritage had been rediscovered by British Orientalists and archaeologists. And of course, one here has to hear mention the wonderful Sir William Jones and James Princeton, thanks to whom the Brahmese script was deciphered, which is why we could read Ashoka's edicts. So I think does this really kind of illustrate one of the themes of this Litfest, crossing borders, in the way that British Orientalists, contrary to Edward Said's strictures, actually rediscovered those classical heritage for us, and crossed cultural borders which were very important.
Those names that you mention are indeed heroes for anyone who is interested in the ancient history of India. You're right. And another figure whom we might also mention here, who was of immense importance, was Alexander Cunningham, the first Director General of the Archaeological Survey. He spent many years traveling throughout India at a time, in the mid-19th century when travel was much less easy than it is today, and recording historical and archaeological sites. His work at Bodh Gaya especially is, but not only there, is of huge importance still today, and his records of the temple at Bodh Gaya both before, during, and after its restoration are of immense importance to us today in understanding that major site in Bihar.
Yeah. Now, Richard, just thinking a little ahead from the Mauryan period, we have the Kushans, we have the Bactrian rulers of the area called Gandhara. How do these illustrate the kind of open borders that existed both culturally and politically at the time?
That's important, and I'm going to show some images just in a moment. But before we leave Amaravati, and bearing in mind the theme of our discussion, I just want to mention that Amaravati was one of the most important centers for the diffusion of Buddhism out of India and into Southeast Asia. And the name Amaravati is still remembered in Thailand, for instance. There's no memory of the actual site, but it is remembered as a place of great religious importance, just as it is also in the Tibetan tradition. And it's no surprise that in recent years, the Dalai Lama has presented the Kalachakra Tantra at Amaravati, because in the Tibetan tradition, that teaching is connected with that place. Now, as you mentioned, on to Gandhara, and of course, this is a fascinating and intriguing period in South Asian cultural history. It's a time when, as you mentioned, the southwest is the northwest is open to Iran, to the Hellenistic and the Roman worlds, and also to Bactria. In the in the 1st century AD, we know that Bactrian nomads entered into northwestern India. We know them today as the Kushans, and they set up both at what's today Kabul and also in Peshawar, but also in Mathura, south of Delhi. So a very wide spanning empire, mostly Buddhist, though of course Mathura had many Jain shrines, and a time that was extremely open to ideas coming in from outside. So the two images that you see on the screen here, obviously the one on the left is the Buddha, the standing Buddha, and the one on the right is a Bodhisattva. It's Maitreya, but of course they appear, first of all, in bodily form, whereas previously the Buddha had not been shown as a human living being. But perhaps more importantly, they are shown as wearing costume that would not have been out of place further west, possibly even as far as the Hellenistic worlds of Syria and Egypt. So the notion of presenting divine figures in this absolutely human form, recognizably, unquestionably human, and shown wearing classical Roman garb, as it were. These are ideas that come in from the West, along with all sorts of other ideas on iconography and coinage and many other ideas of civilization ideas, script, of course, and different scripts, and the use of scripts like Koroshti, for instance, which are probably based on Aramaic. So an important, a very important period.
Sticking with Mathura for a minute,
Yeah.
Mathura also became very much a center of Brahmanical Hindu art under the
A
Gupta
little later, yeah, that's right.
which came almost sort of coterminous with Gandhara. How far was there a struggle between Buddhism and Hinduism during this period, with Hinduism coming out on top and Buddhism virtually disappearing from India?
Well, that's a process that took a very long time, and it does depend, where you are in India. So, we know, for instance, that Buddhism in Orissa survived into the Mughal period. So, it's a very, very long process. But you're right, of course, under the Gupta kings. Sorry, let's move the images on. I put this one up because, of course, it there is shown as Hercules, so he's wearing the skin of the Nemean lion. But let's move away from Gandhara and to the further survivals of Oopsie. We'll need to come back to some of these, perhaps. Right. Now let's look at some of this material, and this is obviously a sculpture of Varaha, the boar-headed incarnation of Vishnu rescuing the earth goddess from the ocean demon. In a late Gupta, very confident, very strong medium. It's undoubtedly true that at the time of the Gupta kings in the 4th, 5th centuries AD, royal patronage, or royal personal patronage, perhaps we should say, is much more closely connected with the cults of early Hinduism, and many of them producing sculpture in Mathura stone, such as this one here of Varaha. That it doesn't mean, though, that the Gupta kings and indeed their successors didn't support and patronize Buddhist artists as well. That undoubtedly continued, and the two seem to have rubbed along together without great conflict. I wouldn't describe it as a time of a conflict other than conflict in words. And we certainly know that further south in what's now Tamil Nadu, there were the early Shaivite saints, for instance, in the 7th, 8th centuries AD, people like Appar and Sambanda and so on. These saints did inveigh against the Buddhists, but it's verbally rather. We don't think that there's no real record of outright hostility and armed conflict. No, that's not the story.
Now you're going to show us a couple of images from Bodh Gaya, aren't you? And my impression was that Bodh Gaya was very much rediscovered again by British archaeologists.
Actually, I don't have any Bodh Gaya images, I don't think, but they're certainly in the book I described.
Yes.
That.
Yes.
But you're absolutely right. The history of, it's a very intriguing story. The history of Buddhism as an Indian religion had practically disappeared in India itself. Knowledge of that had really disappeared. And for instance, when Mckenzie first went to Amaravati, he thought he'd found, on the very first visit, he thought he'd found a Jain shrine. Because Buddhism wasn't something that he or any of his peers encountered in India, and so it wasn't properly understood that Buddhism was originally an Indian religion, and that it then spread outside the subcontinent and indeed declined and was eventually extinguished in the subcontinent. the earliest understanding of Bodh where, of course, the temple was in the control of a Vaishnav Mat there in Bodh the initial understanding of it was very confused, and it was people like Cunningham, whom I mentioned earlier, who began to unpick the story, and it took a long time. You still have people like Waddell, several generations later, still looking to better understand the sites connected with the life of the Buddha. So it's a long story of recovery.
Now, something I know you're keen to talk about, which also spread rather like Buddhism, way beyond India's borders, is India's textiles.
Yes.
And you have a couple of images of those, and you're going to tell us how transnational they were.
Yes, and thank you, Zaria. This is really a subject that intrigues me greatly and which is well represented in the book. The image that you see on the screen at present, this rather sort of moth-eaten looking scrap, is actually probably the earliest surviving example we have today of a woven cotton Indian textile. It's basically, it's a dari in today's terminology. But these scraps, there are this one and 4 or 5 other scraps, were found by Sir Aurel Stein, the great Hungarian, though later British naturalized explorer, who opened up many of the ancient histories of the Taklamakan, the oasis cities of Western China. This fragment comes from Nia on the southern route, and it was found in deposits that can be dated between the 1st and the 3rd century AD. So, I mean, that's why I'm showing it. It's unremarkable to look at, but it's incredibly important because it's so early.
Now, let's. I'm going to have to move on a bit. I'm just conscious of our hour. Can we go back to the Chola kings? Because there was this immense spread of Hinduism and Hindu art across Southeast Asia, which presumably comes from the Cholas.
Well,
maybe you have. Do you have your wonderful Nataraj image?
Yes, I do.
Which is the cover of your book.
Indeed, yes. Before we leave this screen, though, the one on the left is an export from southern India to the Celebes, Sulawesi in Southeast Asia. So carrying on your mention of Southeast Asia, let's go and look at some of these magnificent Chola sculptures. Here, this great image, which if you go to the British Museum Gallery today, you will see this as you walk into the space where the South Asian collections are displayed. The Chola kings were patrons of bronze casters whose work probably has never been surpassed, anyway, in India, and certainly in my opinion. They were incredibly skilled in the manipulation and use of molten bronze. And these great images here, and I think we have another couple here, yes, are wonderful examples of their craft.
John Singh Krishna.
It's not actually, it's Sambandha. Yeah. You're right, very similar to the child Krishna, but actually this pointed finger upwards identifies him as the Saint Sambandha, but very, very similar to dancing Krishna. And the other one, of course, a standard, a Shaiva standard for carrying in processions. And knowledge of how to produce such magnificent bronze sculpture was undoubtedly part of the coincidental inheritance of the Chola presence both in Sri Lanka and indeed in Southeast Asia. Though, having said that, places like, well, certainly Java had been important centers of contact between India and Southeast Asia for many centuries before the Cholas. So the Chola link with zones such as the kingdom of Srivijaya comes at the end of a long period of contact. So, Borobudur, for instance, the great Buddhist shrine on Java, is a sort of three-dimensional mandala, of course, and the mandala idea is originally Indian, but no one in India had ever thought to build one on that scale. So it's a magnificent development of an originally Indian idea. The Chola presence, though, comes a little bit later.
Now, I'm going to move us on. I think we have about 15 minutes left. So I'm going to move us on to Persianist culture.
Yeah.
And I really want to pose the question again. It's become politically controversial whether this was part of the so-called Hindu wound, which was a millennium of foreign rule, and whether the Muslim and Persianist rulers from the 11th century onwards should be regarded as imperial occupiers, or were actually, no, which they certainly are by the Hindutva brigade, or whether they were well integrated into Indian society and produced what in many respects was a very creative fusion of Central Asian, Persian influences with the preceding Hindu and Buddhist ones.
Well, I would certainly agree with your second definition. I don't think there's any serious doubt about that, frankly. And the fact that, of course, if you mention anywhere in the world today, Indian architecture, the first building that people think of course, is the Taj. Not everyone, you may not all agree, but that is the case. I think to disown the many hundreds of years of Mughal and Islamic contact with India is to cut off your nose to spite your face, and of course many of those emperors and rulers in the pre-Mughal period as well as in the Mughal period were keen not only to be imperial powers, but also to understand and to contribute to the culture of their subjects. So in my book, for instance, I have a section on both the Ramayana and the Mahabharat, and both of these great texts, of course, were translated into Persian during the reign of Akbar, and they were that was specifically so that the courtiers, the Mughal courtiers, could understand these great epics and therefore have access to the culture of their subjects. And this is just one small example, but it's an important example. Some people, of course, have questioned the degree to which Aurangzeb wished to meld.
Yes, well, you've got your illustration here has Jahangir weighing his son Shah Jahan, presumably, in rather Hindu fashion.
Indeed.
Was there a change, do you think, from Jahangir down to Shah Jahan and Aurangzeb, who were much more Islamist in their approach than Akbar and Jahangir had been.
Well, Akbar is certainly, frequently held up as a paragon. It's true, but I don't agree with the notion that it's downhill all the way thereafter, and I do believe that the melding of cultural influences was so great by that time that it would be impossible to unpick it. And I think the notion that it all has to be abandoned or negated or done away with or dismissed, all those astonishing links and achievements, that's for the birds, in my opinion.
I suppose one has to acknowledge the fact that certainly in the early Muslim invasions, there was a huge amount of destruction of Hindu temples, Hindu art. One only has to look at the number of statues in temples that have been defaced to see that.
Of course, invasions and war do produce casualties. Of course, I would, one would be foolish to assume otherwise.
In this case, I think there is a strong Islamic belief in not representing people, and certainly not their faces. So the defacement was very much an Islamist phenomenon, which I think perhaps we need to recognize.
Of course, there are many examples of that, but I don't think I have great trouble in looking back on the past and trying to interpret it with today's standards. I think much better to get on and understand it all within the common context. I'm very queasy about attaching blame in retrospect.
Now, shall we move on to another sort of foreign influence, which is often regarded as being intrusive, but in many ways also affected the way that Indian culture developed, and not least our sort of contemporary preoccupations. And I'm talking about European influences, starting with the Portuguese and later with the French and the British, and remaining to this day with our sort of rather globalized contemporary art. So perhaps we should, I think we've got about 10 minutes left. Should we talk about the modern period and the colonial impact, which produced in some ways very creative art, like the Company School of Painting, which rescued Mughal art from decline and breathed new life into it?
Well, certainly this type of painting, which it's a sort of omnium gatherum term, company painting, but painting for the painting by Indian artists for European, often British patrons, is very attractive and very interesting, and tells us a lot about the history of the period. In the British Museum, we have a fine collection of this material, and I'm just going to show two examples here. One of which, this one here, shows a group of Sikh recruits, probably about 1820 in Delhi, and the next one, which I think shows, yes, that's right, two images, one of which, the one on the left side, shows Shiva and Parvati and is from southern India, and is of great interest because it also shows them wearing these spectacular textiles, which are of course such a lure to the British and French in the south. And the other image, which shows a botanical sample, it's from the botanical garden at Shibpur in Calcutta, and shows the clerodendron plant, All three of these show the way in which Indian artists with extraordinary skill managed to change their way of depict the way they produced a picture and produce things that were attractive to their new European patrons. This first one, I think, is particularly interesting because it's connected with the painter who produced the Fraser paintings, Fraser album paintings in Delhi, and it comes with a list of the names of the individual characters. Here we see something that is much more photorealistic, I suppose you would say. It's much less concerned with vibrant design, with sort of the manipulation of color. It's much more graded, and it's moved away completely from the style of painting that we know either from the Mughal court or from the early Pahari courts up in the northern Punjab. So it is a departure for Indian painting and for Indian depictions of the world around them, but it's one that was incredibly productive. And in some of these paintings, like this one of the Clerodendron, is part of the whole scientific examination of both the natural and the geological and geographical world in which the British officers found themselves. This painting was probably commissioned by Roxburgh, the second, I think, or was it the first, superintendent of the garden at Shibpur in Calcutta. So part of that huge scientific project.
So in a way, what we're seeing is that the European influence on Indian art, like the Mughal, was quite positive in many respects. I mean, we got perspective, we got a certain degree of naturalism, and you're going to show us here a couple of silver objects made, I think, by Om Morasia in Kutch.
Yes. Actually, the one on the left was not made by Om, but is very typical of this type of vessel. It's a sporting trophy and has an inscription inside it, whereas the one on the right is indeed from Omosi Mauji's studio. It's a drawing of a vessel made to commission by probably by a British patron, but there were plenty of Indian patrons also of Omosi Mauji, who lived in Kutch. His great period of productivity was in the late, probably the last decade of the 19th century and the 20th century up until the First War. The First War more or less killed his popularity, but this teapot, of course, is a very typical product of his workshop. It has his mark on the base. It's hugely elaborate and densely covered in decoration. And of course, you can imagine how very, very popular this sort of image would have been in the late 19th century, but also how completely unpopular it would have been by the 1920s. You know, you couldn't get much further than the Bauhaus than this.
Well, I'm proud to say I have an Om Morasia box behind me.
Oh, good for you. Well done, Zaria.
Which is very pretty with tigers engraved on it. So coming more to the contemporary period, Richard, which I know you're keen to talk about, and I think we only have a few minutes left. Okay. Would you like to sort of talk a little about contemporary art and why you think it's important to keep that in view?
Well, I think it's very important to keep it in view because, you know, to understand the Indian world, which is our attempt at the British Museum, then we need to understand what's going on today. And as I've mentioned earlier, I think that objects, items that you can hold in your hand, that you can interrogate yourself, these are a hugely productive way of doing it. Photography, of course, has been one of the very important elements in 19th and 20th century, and indeed 21st century South Asian imagining of the world. This is by Lionel Wendt, the Sri Lankan burgher artist, and this is a much more recent work by the current Pakistani artist Bani Abadi, who uses photography to produce her images. And here, it's part of a series. She's placed figures in the street at a certain time of day, and it's the time of the year and the time of the day when most people in Karachi will be breaking their fast after Ramadan. So this woman is clearly not a Muslim. She's wearing a sari. She is indeed a Hindu a member of the community in Karachi. Others in the series show Parsis and Christians. So this is an intriguing way of using photography to comment on today's society.
Richard, I think we have 2 or 3 minutes left. If you want
can I just mention these two paintings here? This is Binod Bihari Mukherjee, and this is Abanindranath Tagore. Both of them were hugely influenced and traveled in the Far East with Tagore. So Chinese and Japanese paintings were enormously influential for them. And then finally, I just want to show a few of the modern items in the BM collection, which comprise both political materials, such as this poster from Pakistan with Richard Nixon, Bhutto and Kosygin visible there in the bottom of the image. And then finally, the last image, the sculpture that you mentioned earlier, Zaria, by Mrinalini Mukherjee. Thank you.
Wonderful. So it's a real tour d'horizon, and I can vouch for the fact that the illustrations we haven't seen are even, well, quite as mouth-watering as the ones we have seen. And so I think once the book is out, it will be hugely enjoyable for anyone interested in South Asian art. It's clearly been a labor of love, and most of your life has been spent researching the material which appears in it. So highly recommended. I'm going to be reviewing it for Open Magazine and look forward to reading it when it's fully out. Thank you very much, Richard. I think we will now hand back to Rachel.
Thank you. Well, I mean, that was a wonderful discussion, Richard, and just the breadth of the book is extraordinary. You know, I mean, it was just fascinating. Now, I'm not going to ask you one of those questions like, should the British Museum return its treasures? I think it might blow its top if I did. So I won't ask you such a very silly question, I think. But what I'd really like to know is, which is your favourite of all those objects? That's a hard question, but there always is a favourite.
Oh gosh, I don't know. Let's say Binod Bihari Mukherjee, the painting right towards the end. Well, I think if that was here in my study, it would be such a calming and beautiful influence. And the fact that it was produced by an artist who worked with Tagore and traveled with him. I mean, Tagore, I think, is such an astonishing character, much of which we still don't fully understand. I think within the parameters of today's discussion, the fact that he described himself as a product of a Hindu, a Muslim, and a British culture, this tells us a lot about where we should be aiming for.
Yes, I do think Tagore is one of those characters who's just very, very hard for us to really get any grip on his real lasting significance and his importance.
Especially, I think, if you don't speak Bengali. But if you do, then here is the picture. Then, I think there are huge riches to be found. And the fact that scholars in recent years have been reevaluating his poetry, moving away from all that Yeats-influenced language that you see in Gitanjali, and considering his educationist work, his rural work, his journalism, his novels, he was such an extraordinary character.
Zareer, would you like to say anything?
Well, I think I think I've said enough, but I'm conscious of the time because we were meant to keep within an hour, weren't we?
We were. I just wondered if you wanted to have a quick mention of Tagore.
No, I will leave Richard to with the admiration for him. I have to admit he's not one of my favorite authors, and I'm not a great fan of his school of painting. But tastes. That's the good thing about it. The tastes can differ.
Well, I'm learning some Bengali in my retirement, so look forward
to you. Well done.
Finally. So let's hope I can catch up with it. But Richard, this book is wonderful. I'm looking forward to seeing, the printed edition with all the drawings and the images shown clearly. And congratulations. It's a great book one can only produce when one has worked so closely with the objects themselves over so many years. I mean, daunting from,
impossible. Frankly, impossible. Certain things I managed to write practically in my sleep. Other things I had to take weeks to, produce 2 sentences. So I've learned a great deal, and it's been like a sort of brain dump for me in my retirement from the museum. Knowledge gained over 32 years or so. Yes.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Excellent. And look forward to reading your review of it soon, Zareer. So many thanks to our 2 wonderful speakers today. I think, that was a discussion that people are really going to listen to carefully, and then get the book, go to the museum. Now we can go back again. And I think this would have been something which would have been lovely to have Khushwant's own inputs into what he thought were the objects that defined India. Thank you both very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, cheerio.